The iron gates of Mountain View High would open at precisely 7:15 each morning. Dr. Joseph Morrow's routine never varied. Park his silver Honda in spot B12, walk the curved path to the entrance, and greet every student by name. Parents dropping off their children would pause to wave, teachers would share a knowing smile, and even the most rebellious teenagers would straighten their shoulders as they passed him. Against the backdrop of Utah's Wasatch Mountains, these morning exchanges represented everything Cedar Valley believed about itself, a place where trust was given freely and authority was earned through decades of dedication. That trust had weathered 22 years of challenges. Dr. Morrow had guided the school through budget cuts, curriculum changes, and the shifting tides of educational reform. He'd written hundreds of college recommendations, attended thousands of football games, and knew the stories behind every trophy in the glass cases that lined the main hall. His wife Gina's chocolate chip cookies were a tradition at staff meetings, and together they'd transformed the school's key club into a model of youth leadership that other districts tried to emulate. Joe Morrow built this school, people would say, meaning not the brick and steel structure, but the spirit within it. He's one of us. Under his leadership, Mountain View High had become more than just an educational institution. It was the heart of Cedar Valley, a place where Friday night football games drew crowds that rivaled Sunday church services, where college acceptance letters were celebrated as community victories, and where 3 generations of families had walked the same halls. Dr. Morrow had modernized the curriculum while preserving the traditions that gave the school its character. The annual homecoming parade still followed the same route down Main Street that it had since 1975, but now featured robots built by the engineering club alongside the traditional floats. Students knew they could count on Dr. Morrow's support, whether they were struggling with calculus or dealing with family problems. He'd been known to spend hours after school helping seniors perfect their college essays, and his letter of recommendation could open doors at universities across the country. The Morrows were fixtures at every school event, from debate tournaments to theatrical productions, their presence as reliable as the mountain peaks that framed the valley. Then came the October morning in 2018 when his spot in the parking lot stayed empty. The previous evening, Carly Moore had walked into the Cedar Valley Police Department. Her mother's hand rested on her shoulder as she filed a report that would split the community in two. 3 years after her graduation, she was ready to speak about what she claimed had happened in Dr. Morrow's office during her senior year, an afternoon meeting about college applications that she alleged had turned into sexual assault. The accusation cracked Cedar Valley's foundation like frost-splitting rock. In living rooms and church basements, at Friday night football games and Sunday dinners, people struggled to reconcile 2 opposing truths. They thought of Dr. Morrow helping their children navigate college applications, remembering his patience, his dedication, his seemingly transparent approach to leadership. Then they looked at Carly Moore, once the editor of the school newspaper, now a hollow-eyed young woman whose hands shook as she told her story to Detective Liza Brown. Detective Brown, a 15-year veteran of the force, had handled sensitive cases before, but nothing that had divided the community so deeply. She watched as long-standing friendships fractured along invisible lines. Teachers who had worked together for decades now ate lunch in separate rooms. Parents who had once carpooled together stopped making eye contact at school pickup. Consider the source, Dr. Morrow's supporters would say. Carly was always a straight-A student. Why wait 3 years to speak up? Why now? They pointed to his decades of service, the hundreds of students he'd helped, the countless hours he'd devoted to making Mountain View High a place of excellence. But others remembered moments they dismissed, his closed office door during after-school meetings, the way certain female students seemed to avoid walking past the administration wing. We saw what we wanted to see, a teacher of 30 years confided to Detective Brown. Sometimes that's easier than seeing what's really there. The school board placed Dr. Morrow on administrative leave while Detective Brown built her case. His nameplate came down from the office door. Teachers boxed up the plaque celebrating his achievements, unsure whether to store them or destroy them. In the faculty lounge, conversations would stop when certain people entered the room. The divide spread beyond the school walls. At the local diner, regular customers requested to be seated in sections where they wouldn't have to face former friends who had taken the opposite side. Carly's parents, Johnson and Mary Moore, watched their daughter retreat into herself all over again. They spoke of changes they'd noticed during her senior year, her sudden withdrawal from debate club, inexplicable panic attacks, a college acceptance letter that sat unopened for weeks. "We thought it was normal teenage stress," Mary said, her voice breaking during her interview with Detective Brown. "We should have asked more questions. We should have seen the signs." Dr. Morrow maintained his innocence through his attorney. "I've dedicated my life to protecting students," his statement read. "These allegations destroy not just me, but everything Cedar Valley believes about itself." His wife Gina stood firmly by his side, continuing to attend church services despite the whispers, holding her head high as she walked through the grocery store where displays still featured photos of Dr. Morrow presenting academic awards. He was right about one thing: the allegations had cracked open the seemingly perfect facade of small-town life. As Detective Brown gathered evidence and interviewed witnesses, Cedar Valley residents found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about trust, authority, and the price of silence in close-knit communities where reputation often matters more than truth. The investigation would eventually expose layers of complexity that defied easy answers, forcing everyone to confront an uncomfortable reality: sometimes the people we trust the most are the ones we actually know the least. The Cedar Valley courthouse had never seen anything like it. By 7 each morning, two distinct groups would form on opposite sides of the stone steps, Dr. Morrow's supporters on the right, Carly's on the left, their silence toward each other more deafening than any protest could be. The October 2019 trial was about to expose wounds that no verdict could fully heal. Inside Courtroom 3, with its oak benches and fluorescent lights, District Attorney Rachel Hopkins built her case methodically. She began not with Carly's testimony, but with the small details that had gone unnoticed for years. A janitor testified about Dr. Morrow's car being the last in the parking lot 3 or 4 nights a week. A school secretary described the gradual shift in his open-door policy, how afternoon meetings had become increasingly private, with instructions not to interrupt. When Carly took the stand on the trial's 4th day, the courtroom fell silent. Gone was the confident newspaper editor who had once challenged the school board over budget cuts. In her place sat a young woman whose hands trembled as she adjusted the microphone. For 3 hours, she detailed the afternoon that had altered her life's trajectory, what began as a college application review and ended, she testified, in locked-door terror. "He had this way of making you feel special," Carly testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like you were the only student who mattered. Until that day, I thought it meant I was lucky to have such a dedicated principal." Detective Brown presented the evidence she'd gathered, text messages Carly had sent to her best friend in the weeks following the alleged assault. "Can't sleep again," one read. "Keep thinking about what happened in his office. Don't know who to tell." Another, "Mom keeps asking why I'm not excited about college anymore. How do I explain when I can't even explain it to myself?" The prosecution called former teachers who described the changes they'd observed in Carly during her senior year. Her calculus teacher testified about a student who had gone from leading study groups to sitting silently in the back row. Her debate coach recalled how she'd withdrawn from the state championships without explanation, a competition she'd spent 3 years preparing for. Defense attorney James Blackwell fought back with equal intensity. He presented Dr. Morrow's immaculate personnel file, containing hundreds of letters from grateful parents and students. He called character witnesses who spoke of Dr. Morrow's dedication, the Saturday morning SAT prep sessions he'd organized, the scholarship programs he'd developed for low-income students, the countless hours he'd spent mentoring troubled teens. "This is a man," Blackwell argued, "who has touched thousands of lives, all for the better. Are we to believe that after 22 years of exemplary service, he suddenly became a predator?" But it was Gina Morrow's testimony that captured the community's attention. She took the stand wearing the same pearl necklace she'd worn to every graduation ceremony for the past 2 decades. Her testimony painted a picture of a marriage built on trust and shared dedication to education. She spoke of their morning ritual, coffee at 5 a.m., discussing which students needed extra support that day. Under cross-examination, however, cracks appeared in her certainty. District Attorney Hopkins pressed her about the late-night meetings, the closed office door, the times she'd called the school looking for her husband only to be told he was in private student conferences. "Did you ever question why these meetings needed to be so private?" Hopkins asked. "I trusted him," Gina replied, her voice breaking. "We all did." The jury deliberated for 3 days. In local diners and coffee shops, conversations fell silent whenever the courthouse doors opened, everyone watching for signs of a decision. The division in the community had grown so deep that longtime friends found themselves sitting at separate tables, unable to bridge the gulf between their conflicting beliefs. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the reaction rippled through Cedar Valley like a thunderclap. In the courtroom, Dr. Morrow stood motionless as Judge Maria Hernandez read the sentence, 15 years. His only visible reaction came when the bailiff approached with handcuffs. He turned to look at his wife, mouthing words that no one else could hear. Outside, the crowd's reaction reflected the town's division. Carly's supporters released purple balloons, the color of domestic violence awareness. Dr. Morrow's supporters huddled in prayer circles, some holding signs that read, "Wrong man, wrong verdict." But the verdict didn't bring the closure many had hoped for. At Mountain View High, teachers struggled to explain to students how someone they'd trusted could have caused such harm. The school board rushed to implement new policies about one-on-one meetings with students, but the damage to institutional trust had already been done. Carly and her family retreated from public life. "The truth doesn't always set you free," her father told reporters. "Sometimes it just shows you how complicated freedom really is." Detective Brown filed her final report, but the questions it raised went far beyond the scope of any police investigation. How does a community heal when trust itself becomes suspect? What happens to faith in authority when authority proves fallible? For Cedar Valley, the answers to these questions would prove elusive. The conviction of Dr. Joseph Morrow marked not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a longer conversation about power, trust, and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we think we know best. 2 years into his 15-year sentence, Dr. Joseph Morrow had adapted to the rhythms of prison life. He taught GED classes to fellow inmates, wrote weekly letters to his wife, and maintained a wall calendar where he meticulously marked off the days. But in early 2021, a phone call from appellate attorney Sandra Botsford would shatter that routine and reopen wounds Cedar Valley had desperately tried to heal. "We found something," Botsford told him through the scratchy prison phone line. "Something that changes everything." That something was buried in the digital cloud, a string of text messages between Carly Moore and her classmate Sarah Bennett, recovered from a forgotten backup. Messages that painted a starkly different picture of the afternoon that had sent Dr. Morrow to prison. "Just finished my college app meeting with Dr. M," read one message, timestamped just hours after the alleged assault. "He spent 2 hours helping me perfect my essay. I'm actually feeling confident about Harvard now. He really believes in me." Another message, sent the following day, "Got my recommendation letter from Dr. M today. Made me cry, in a good way. He really saw me, you know. All the stuff about my debate championships and that article I wrote about school funding. Even mentioned how I handled that crisis with my parents last year." These messages stood in direct contradiction to Carly's testimony about that afternoon. There was no hint of trauma, no suggestion of impropriety, only gratitude and hope. When Botsford presented them to the appellate court, along with evidence that 2 jurors had posted prejudicial comments about Dr. Morrow on social media before the trial, the foundation of the conviction began to crack. But it wasn't just the messages. As Botsford dug deeper, she discovered what the original investigation had missed. Emma Martinez, a former student who had remained silent during the trial, finally came forward. She revealed that during senior year, Carly had been grappling with her parents' messy divorce and her mother's subsequent depression, factors that might explain the behavioral changes her teachers had observed. "I wanted to speak up during the trial," Emma testified in her affidavit. "But everyone had already decided he was guilty. Speaking up for Dr. Morrow meant being seen as anti-victim, anti-woman. I couldn't handle that pressure at 18. The appellate court's decision to overturn the conviction landed like a bomb in Cedar Valley. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Morrow's supporters celebrated with tears and prayers, their "Free Dr. Morrow" signs finally bearing fruit. But across town, at the crisis center where Carly had received counseling, advocates for sexual assault survivors gathered in stunned silence. "What message does this send?" asked Maria Chen, director of the Cedar Valley Rape Crisis Center. "That unless a victim has perfect evidence, perfect memories, perfect text messages documenting their trauma in real time, they shouldn't come forward?" Detective Liza Brown faced her own reckoning. The department's internal review questioned how the original investigation had missed these messages, why Emma Martinez hadn't been interviewed more thoroughly, whether the pressure to solve such a high-profile case had led to tunnel vision. "We followed the evidence we had," Brown stated at a tense press conference. "But clearly, there was more to find. That's a weight I'll carry for the rest of my career." The reversal fractured Cedar Valley along new lines. Those who had supported Dr. Morrow felt vindicated but also angry, at the justice system, at those who had doubted him, at the 2 years stolen from his life. His supporters demanded accountability, calling for investigations into the prosecution's handling of the case. Those who had stood with Carly now struggled with doubt, though many remained convinced of her truth. "Trauma doesn't always leave a neat trail of evidence," said her former debate coach. "The absence of pain in a text message doesn't mean the pain wasn't real." Carly herself retreated further from public view. Through her attorney, she maintained her account of that afternoon. "The recovery of selected messages doesn't erase what happened. Memory and pain are complex. My truth remains my truth." Dr. Morrow emerged from prison a changed man. The confident educator who had once commanded respect with just his presence now moved carefully, spoke softly, seemed to fold in on himself. Gina had kept his clothes hanging in their closet, his coffee mug in the kitchen cabinet, his spot at the dinner table empty, waiting for a return that now felt more complicated than triumphant. "How do you rebuild a life after something like this?" Gina asked during a brief statement to the press. "We're grateful for the truth coming out, but the cost. The cost has been beyond measure." The school board faced its own challenges. The policies implemented after Dr. Morrow's conviction, about student meetings, closed doors, one-on-one interactions, now seemed simultaneously more and less necessary. Parents demanded answers about how to talk to their children about a situation where neither complete trust nor complete suspicion seemed appropriate. Professor Emily Lawson, a criminal justice expert at the University of Utah, observed that the case exemplified the complexities of sexual assault allegations in close-knit communities. "These cases are rarely black and white," she noted. "They force us to confront uncomfortable questions about memory, truth, and how much evidence is enough evidence. Sometimes, there are no satisfying answers." As Cedar Valley grappled with the aftermath of the reversal, the certainties that had once defined the community seemed to dissolve. The mountain peaks that had witnessed the whole saga remained unchanged, but the town and their shadow had been fundamentally altered. Trust, once broken and then rebuilt, had been shattered again. Dr. Morrow's case became a cautionary tale, but about what, exactly? The dangers of rushing to judgment? The complexities of trauma and memory? The way truth in small towns can be both absolutely known and eternally uncertain? Perhaps the only certainty was that Cedar Valley would never be quite the same. The iron gates of Mountain View High still opened each morning at 7:15, but the simple trust they once represented had been replaced by something more complicated, a recognition that in matters of truth and justice, even the surest paths can lead to unexpected destinations. 5 years after Carly Moore first walked into the Cedar Valley Police Department, the town still wrestles with the shadows of uncertainty. The Wasatch Mountains remain steadfast against the sky, but beneath them, a community that once prided itself on knowing every truth now questions everything it thought it knew. In his modest home office, Detective Marcus Rivera, who took over the case review from the retiring Detective Brown, spreads out 2 timelines on his desk. One tells the story that sent Dr. Morrow to prison, a trusted educator betraying his position of power. The other, built from recovered text messages and new witness statements, suggests a different narrative entirely. Between these competing truths lies a gap that no amount of investigation seems able to bridge. The hardest part, Rivera says, rubbing his tired eyes, isn't finding evidence. It's understanding what that evidence means. A text message showing gratitude doesn't disprove trauma. The absence of immediate outcry doesn't mean nothing happened. But then again, neither scenario proves guilt. The Utah State Attorney General's comprehensive review has raised more questions than answers. Their preliminary findings highlight systemic issues, the pressure on small-town police departments to resolve high-profile cases quickly, the challenges of maintaining investigative objectivity in close-knit communities, the way social media can shape and distort public opinion before any evidence reaches a courtroom. At Mountain View High, new protocols govern every interaction between staff and students. Security cameras now monitor previously private spaces. Meetings require open doors and third-party presence. Trust, once the foundation of education, has been replaced by documentation and surveillance. "We're protecting everyone," says Principal Patricia Larkin, who took over after Dr. Morrow's conviction. But something precious has been lost. When a student needs to talk about family problems or college fears, they now face a barrier of procedures and witnesses. Safety matters, but at what cost to genuine connection? The ripples extend beyond Cedar Valley. Sexual assault support centers across Utah report a troubling trend, survivors hesitating to come forward, haunted by Carly's experience. "They ask us," says Counselor Maria Chen, "if they don't have perfect evidence, if their text messages don't show immediate trauma, if they waited to report, does that mean no one will believe them?" Dr. Morrow's return to Cedar Valley was not the triumphant homecoming his supporters imagined. He and Gina sold their house on Maple Street, moving to a smaller home on the outskirts of town. He declined offers to return to education, instead focusing on writing a book about his experience, not to proclaim innocence or assign blame, he says, but to explore how justice and truth can become tangled beyond recognition. "I lost 2 years of my life," he wrote in a statement released through his attorney. "But this town lost something even more valuable, its certainty. Its ability to trust not just individuals, but the very systems meant to protect us all." Carly Moore left Utah entirely. Her parents still defend her account, pointing out that trauma doesn't follow a predictable pattern, that text messages can mask pain, that young victims often try to maintain normalcy even after devastating experiences. They've established a foundation advocating for more nuanced approaches to investigating sexual assault cases. The Cedar Valley Courthouse stands as it has for generations, but those who enter now carry a heavier burden of doubt. Prosecutors approach sexual assault cases with increased caution, knowing that certainty can dissolve in the face of new evidence. Defense attorneys dig deeper into digital footprints, knowing that truth might hide in forgotten cloud backups. Professor Emily Lawson, completing her comprehensive study of the case, suggests that its true significance lies not in determining absolute guilt or innocence, but in exposing the limitations of our current approach to justice. "We want clear villains and heroes," she writes. "We want evidence that points in one direction. We want truth to be obvious. But cases like this force us to confront a more complicated reality. Cedar Valley's experience has become a case study in law schools and police academies across the country. It raises essential questions. How do we balance the rights of the accused with support for alleged victims? How do we maintain investigative integrity when social media can turn local cases into national spectacles? How do we preserve community bonds when neighbors find themselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable divide? Perhaps the most profound impact is the most subtle, the way Cedar Valley residents now regard their own certainties. At the diner where townspeople still gather for morning coffee, conversations about the case have evolved from heated debates about guilt or innocence to more nuanced discussions about the nature of truth itself. Maybe that's the real lesson, suggests Reverend Thomas King, who counseled both the Morrows and the Moores throughout the ordeal. Not that we should trust less, but that we should be more humble about our certainties. Every truth we think we know might look different from another angle, in another light, with more evidence. The mountains of Cedar Valley still cast their shadows each evening, just as they did on that autumn day when Carly Moore first stepped into the police station. They stand as silent witnesses to a story that reminds us how the deepest truths can shift like desert sands beneath our feet. Perhaps you've lived in a town like Cedar Valley. Perhaps you've trusted someone the way they trusted Dr. Morrow. Perhaps you've questioned your own certainties the way this community now questions theirs. This isn't just their story, it's a mirror reflecting our own assumptions about truth, justice, and the stories we tell ourselves about the people we think we know. If this case has stirred something in you, share it with others who understand that the most important conversations are often the most difficult ones. Subscribe to True Crime Case Tapes for more stories that challenge our perceptions and remind us that in the search for justice, the hardest truths are the ones that refuse to stay buried. Until our next investigation, remember, when everyone thinks they know the truth, that's exactly when we need to dig deeper.